The wind did not howl, it shrieked, a high and tearing sound that felt less like weather and more like a living thing trying to claw through the heavy wool of her coat. May stumbled, her boots sinking deep into the drift, the leather numb and stiff against her freezing skin. She could not feel her toes any more. She could barely feel the tips of her fingers inside the oversized mittens she had stolen from the stable boy 3 days ago. 3 days of running. 3 days of looking over her shoulder at the white emptiness, expecting to see the black shape of a horse and the flash of silver spurs. But there was nothing behind her now except the storm, a wall of driving snow that erased her footprints as soon as she made them. That should have been a comfort. It should have meant safety. But the cold was a different kind of hunter, one that did not shout or strike, but simply waited, patient and inevitable, for her to stop moving. She fell, her knees hitting the hard-packed ice beneath the powder, and for a moment she just stayed there. It would be so easy to close her eyes. The snow felt almost warm now, a trick of the mind that her grandmother had once warned her about. If the cold feels like a blanket, you are already dying. May forced herself up, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps that tasted of iron and ice. She saw a shape ahead. It was not a tree. It was too straight, too squared against the chaos of the wind. A cabin. Dark wood, heavy logs, a chimney struggling to vent gray smoke into the white sky. It looked like a fortress. It looked like a trap. But she had no choice. She dragged herself forward, every step a negotiation with gravity, until her hands struck the rough timber of the door. She didn't have the strength to knock. She simply slid down the wood, curling into a ball on the small, dry patch of the porch, the darkness taking her before she even felt the door open. When the light came, it wasn't the harsh, gray glare of the storm. It was gold. Soft, flickering, warm gold. May blinked, her eyelashes heavy and wet, and realized she was not on the porch. She was not in the snow. She was lying on something soft, a mattress filled with straw and lavender, covered in a quilt that smelled of cedar and wood smoke. Panic spiked in her chest, sharp and immediate. She scrambled backward, her back hitting a wall, her eyes darting around the room. It was a single room, large and tidy, illuminated by the fire roaring in the stone hearth. And there was a man. He was not looking at her. He was standing by the stove, his back turned, his shoulders broad under a flannel shirt. He was doing something ordinary, something rhythmic, grinding coffee. The sound was loud in the quiet room, a steady crunch, crunch, crunch that seemed aggressively normal compared to the terror in her veins. He paused, sensing her movement, but he did not turn around fast. He did not lunge. He moved slowly, setting the grinder down with a deliberate clink, and turned to face her. He was older than the stable boys, but younger than the man she called Stepfather. His face was weathered, lines etched around his eyes from squinting at the sun or the snow, and he had a beard that was trimmed close. He held up his hands, palms open, empty. "Easy," he said. His voice was deep, scraping like gravel over velvet, but it wasn't loud. It was the voice one used for a spooked horse. "You're safe. The storm is bad, but the roof is tight." He didn't step closer. He stayed by the stove, putting the width of the room between them. May pressed herself harder against the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She waited for the questions. "Who are you? What did you steal? Who owns you?" But the questions didn't come. Instead, the man turned back to the stove, poured hot water from a kettle into a tin cup, and set it on the edge of the table nearest to her. Then he retreated, pulling a wooden chair to the far side of the room, near the window where the snow battered the glass. He sat down and picked up a book, not looking at her. "Drink," he said, reading the page. "It's got honey in it. Helps the shake." May stared at him. She stared at the cup. Her throat was so dry it felt like parchment, and the smell of the steam, mint and honey, was intoxicating. Slowly, keeping her eyes fixed on him, She crawled toward the edge of the bed and reached for the cup. Her hands trembled so badly the liquid sloshed over the rim, burning her fingers, but the pain was grounding. It was real. She brought the cup to her lips and drank. The warmth hit her stomach like a physical blow, thawing the ice that had settled in her marrow. She drank until the cup was empty, and when she set it down, the man turned a page. He didn't look up. He didn't ask for gratitude. He simply existed in the same space, a quiet, solid presence that demanded nothing. For the first time in 3 days, for the first time in years, May let her shoulders drop. She didn't sleep, but she stopped shaking. The storm raged outside, screaming and tearing at the world, but inside there was only the crackle of the fire and the sound of a stranger turning a page. The next morning broke with a silence so profound it woke her. The wind had died in the night, leaving the world buried under 3 feet of fresh stillness. May lay still, listening. She heard the snap of dry wood, the sizzle of grease in a pan. The smells were different today. Bacon, strong coffee, stale bread toasting on a skillet. She sat up, pulling the quilt tight around her throat. The man, Harlan, she would later learn, though he offered the name like it was a tool he rarely used, was already dressed in heavy outdoor gear. He wore a sheepskin coat and tall boots, and he was packing a saddlebag near the door. He looked up as she moved, his expression unreadable but not unkind. "Mornin'," he said. He pointed to the table. A plate was waiting. Eggs, dark yolk and rich. A thick slab of bread. "I have to check the trap line. North Ridge. Won't be long." He paused, his hand on the iron latch of the door. "The bar is on the inside. You can drop it when I leave. I'll knock 3 times when I get back." He waited for her to nod, but she didn't. She couldn't. She just watched him. He seemed to understand. He opened the door, a blast of Arctic air rushing in for a second before he slipped out and pulled it shut. May waited 5 seconds, then 10. Then she scrambled off the bed, her bare feet hitting the cold floorboards, and rushed to the door. She dropped the heavy iron bar into place with a clang that echoed in her chest. Locked. She was locked in. But for the first time, she was on the side of the lock that felt like power, not prison. She moved to the window, peering through the frosted glass. She saw him wading through the hip-deep snow toward a small barn, his movements efficient and strong. He didn't look back at the cabin. He didn't check to see if she was running. He trusted the snow to keep her there. Or perhaps he simply didn't care if she fled. That thought was confusing. Men always cared. Men always wanted to know where their property was. She ate the food standing up, devouring it with her hands, wiping the grease on her skirt. It was the best meal she had ever tasted. As her strength returned, so did her curiosity. She moved through the cabin, touching things. A rifle mounted above the mantel, clean, oiled, deadly. A stack of books on the table, poetry, almanacs, a worn Bible. No women's things, no soft touches. This was a man who lived alone, a man who lived with silence. She found a basin of water and a cloth, and she washed the grime from her face, flinching when she saw her reflection in the small mirror by the washstand. A bruise bloomed purple and yellow along her jawline, a parting gift from the life she had left. She touched it, wincing. It was fading. Everything was fading. When the knocking came hours later, 3 sharp, distinct raps, May froze. The fear surged back, irrational and overwhelming. What if it wasn't him? What if the stepfather had found the tracks? But the rhythm was exact. 1, 2, 3. She approached the door, her hand hovering over the iron bar. She waited. "It's Harlan," the voice came through the wood, muffled. "I've got firewood." She lifted the bar. The door opened, and he stepped in, carrying an armload of split logs covered in snow. He didn't look at her immediately. He went straight to the hearth and dumped the wood, shaking the snow from his gloves. Only then did he turn. He saw the empty plate. He saw the clean face. He saw the bruise. His eyes lingered on the mark for a fraction of a second, and his jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. But he said nothing about it. "Wind's picking up again," was all he said. "More snow coming." He took off his coat and hung it by the door. "You talk?" he asked, not aggressively, just a simple inquiry. May pressed her lips together and shook her head. It wasn't exactly a lie. She could speak, but she had learned that words were trap doors. You opened your mouth and you fell through into punishment. Silence was safer. Silence was armor. Harlan nodded, accepting this without question. "All right," he said. "Silence is fine. The quiet suits this place." He moved to the kitchen area, starting to prepare something for the evening meal. He moved around her as if she were a nervous cat, never moving too fast, never cornering her. If he needed to cross the room, he took the long way, leaving her a clear path to the door or the corner. It was a dance of avoidance, a physical language of respect she had never encountered. Men usually took up all the space. They filled a room with their size and their demands. Harlan seemed to try to make himself smaller, to contain his presence so it wouldn't spill over onto her. Days bled into a week. The routine became a heartbeat. Wake, eat, Harlan works, May watches, sleep. The snow kept falling, sealing them into a white capsule of existence. May began to do small things. She swept the floor. She mended a tear in one of his spare shirts, leaving it folded on his pillow. He never thanked her with words, but the next day she found a small carving of a bird. No, not a carving. A smooth river stone he must have found, polished and round, left by her plate. It was a trade. Labor for beauty. Service for acknowledgement. It was a currency she understood, but the exchange rate was bafflingly generous. She wasn't used to kindness that didn't come with a bill of sale attached. On the 8th day, the weather broke. The sky turned a piercing, brilliant blue, and the sun glared off the snow with blinding intensity. Harlan announced he was going to town. "Supplies," he said, checking the cinch on his horse outside. "And news. Roads will be passable for the mail coach." He looked at her, standing in the doorway wrapped in his spare blanket. "You stay inside. Keep the door barred. Don't open it for anyone but me. 3 knocks." He hesitated, his hand on the saddle horn. "I'll bring back some wool. You can make something that fits you better than my rags." It was the closest he had come to acknowledging that she might stay, that she might have a future here beyond the storm. May nodded, her throat tight. She watched him ride away, a dark speck moving against the blinding white, until he disappeared into the tree line. The silence without him was different. It wasn't peaceful, it was heavy. The cabin felt too big, too exposed. May spent the day pacing, checking the windows, checking the rifle she didn't know how to fire. She felt a phantom itch between her shoulder blades, the sensation of being watched. She knew it was impossible. No one knew she was here. But fear is not rational. It is biological. It lives in the blood. By late afternoon, the shadows were stretching long and blue across the snow, and the temperature was plummeting. She sat by the fire, straining her ears for the sound of hoofbeats. When she finally heard them, the rhythm was wrong. It was too fast, too urgent. She scrambled to the door, checking the bar, checking the lock. She backed away, grabbing a heavy iron poker from the fireplace. The horse stopped outside, heavy breathing, the creak of leather. Then steps on the porch. Heavy steps. 1, 2, 3. But they were hard, angry knocks. May held her breath. "May, it's Harlan. Open up." His voice was tight, different. There was a jagged edge to it. She hesitated. Was it him? It sounded like him, but... Open the door, girl, now. The command startled her into action. She lifted the bar and the door flew open. Harlan didn't walk in. He strode in, bringing a gust of freezing air and anxiety with him. He slammed the door and threw the bar back into place instantly. He turned to her and his face was grim. The gentle, quiet man of the last week was gone. In his place was a soldier, a guardian. He looked her up and down, checking for injury, then moved to the window, peering out through the crack in the curtains. Pack your things, he said, his voice low. Whatever you can carry, we might need to move. May stared at him, the poker hanging limp in her hand. She made a questioning gesture, a small lift of her hand. Harlan turned from the window, his eyes hard. I was in the saloon, getting the flour. A man came in. Big man, expensive coat. Had a posse with him. Harlan paused, watching her reaction. He's putting up posters, looking for a stolen investment. A Chinese girl, mute, runaway. May felt the blood drain from her face. The room spun. The stepfather. He wasn't just looking, he was hunting. He was here. In this territory. Harlan stepped closer, his voice dropping to a rumble. He says you stole gold. He says you're dangerous. He's offering $500. That's enough money to turn every desperate soul in this valley into a tracker. Harlan walked over to the table and slammed his fist down, not in anger at her, but in frustration at the situation. I didn't say a word. But the shopkeeper, he saw me buying the wool. He saw me buying the women's boots. Harlan looked at her, his eyes searching hers. They know I'm not alone up here. It's only a matter of time before they put it together. He began to pace, checking the rifle, counting the ammunition boxes. I can hold them off from the ridge if they come in daylight, but if they come at night... He stopped and looked at her. I need to know. The man, the one looking for you. He calls himself your father? May shook her head violently. No, never that. Harlan nodded. Husband? She shook her head again. Harlan frowned. Then what is he to you? Why is he hunting you through a blizzard for $500? He waited, desperate for an answer that pantomime couldn't give. I can't protect you if I don't know the stakes, girl. Is he the law? Is he family? May stood there trembling. The truth was locked behind her teeth, a poison she had swallowed long ago. But looking at Harlan, this man who had given her his bed, who had asked for nothing, who was now loading a gun to stand between her and the devil, she knew silence was no longer armor. Silence was a weapon that would get him killed. She saw him moving toward the window again, saw the tension in his back. He was calculating the odds of a firefight. He was preparing to die for a stranger. She took a step forward. The floorboard creaked. Harlan turned, surprised by her movement. She opened her mouth. The voice that came out was rusty, unused, jagged like broken glass. It was small, but it cut through the tension in the room like a knife. "He is not my father," she whispered. Harlan went still. He stared at her, arrested by the sound. She took a breath, the air shuddering in her lungs, and forced the next words out, the truth that she had carried like a stone. "He is a merchant." She looked at Harlan's confused brow and clarified, her voice gaining a terrifying hollow strength. "He sells wives to the miners, to the camps." She paused, her eyes locking onto Harlan's. "He doesn't want me back to sell me. He wants me dead." Harlan lowered the rifle slowly. "Dead? Why? You're worth money to him." May looked at the door, at the darkness pressing against the wood, and then back to the man who had saved her. She spoke the words that changed the air in the room, the words that made the warmth of the fire vanish instantly. "Because I saw what he did to the ones who didn't sell," she said, "and I know where the bodies are buried." Harlan's face went pale. The blood drained from his skin, leaving him looking as cold as the snow outside. His grip on the rifle tightened until his knuckles were white. He wasn't just facing a greedy stepfather or a jilted husband. He was standing in the path of a man who was erasing evidence. A mass murderer. The stakes had not just risen, they had exploded. He looked at May, really looked at her, seeing not just a victim, but a witness to hell. "God help us," Harlan whispered. He didn't tell her to pack anymore. He walked to the door and slid the second, lower bolt into place. He turned down the lantern until the room was plunged into shadow, lit only by the dying embers of the fire. He came back to her, and for the first time, he reached out and took her hand. His palm was calloused and warm. "He won't take you," Harlan said, and his voice was no longer the soft voice of the caretaker. It was the hard, final voice of a man who had found his war. "He'll have to burn this mountain down to get to you." The night that followed was not a time of rest. It was a time of fortification. The cabin, once a haven of soft light and warm smells, transformed into a fortress of shadow and calculated angles. Harlan moved with a grim efficiency that frightened May almost as much as the man hunting her. He extinguished the main lantern, leaving only the dying glow of the coals to paint the room in shades of deep orange and black. He dragged the heavy oak table across the floor, the wood groaning in protest, and upended it in front of the door. He took the mattress from the bed frame and pushed it into the corner furthest from the windows, creating a nest surrounded by the solid logs of the walls. "Stay there," he instructed, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the floorboards. "If glass breaks, you don't move. If you hear shouting, you don't move. You become part of the wall." May obeyed, curling into the corner, watching him. She watched as he checked the rifle again, counting the brass cartridges, lining them up on the windowsill like little soldiers. He wasn't frantic, he was methodical. It was the calm of a man who had expected war to find him eventually, even this high up in the clouds. May felt a surge of guilt so potent it tasted like bile. She looked at this man, this stranger who had given her tea in silence, and saw the danger she had brought to his doorstep. She was a curse. That was what the stepfather had always said, and now she was proving him right. She crawled out of the safety of the mattress, ignoring Harlan's sharp intake of breath, and stood beside him at the window. He looked down at her, his eyes shadowed. "I told you to stay put," he whispered, but there was no bite in it. May reached out, her hand trembling, and touched the sleeve of his sheepskin coat. She pointed to the back door, then made a motion of running, pointing at herself. "Let me go. I will draw them away." Harlan understood immediately. His expression hardened, the lines around his mouth deepening into a scowl of absolute refusal. He caught her hand, his grip firm but careful, trapping her cold fingers in his warmth. "No," he said, and the word was a stone wall. "We don't trade lives here. You aren't bait, and I'm not a martyr. We wait. We hold." He released her hand slowly, letting the sensation of his grip linger on her skin. "Besides," he added, turning back to the dark tree line, "snow's too deep. You wouldn't make it a mile. And I'm not in the habit of losing things I've found." The hours stretched like taffy, thin and brittle. The wind picked up again, masking the sounds of the world outside, which was both a blessing and a curse. Every creak of the roof beams sounded like a boot step. Every snap of a branch sounded like a gunshot. To keep the panic from eating them alive, Harlan began to talk. He didn't look at her, keeping his eyes on the white expanse outside, but his voice was directed straight at her fear. He told her about the cabin, how he had built it log by log after the war, seeking a place where the noise of the world couldn't reach him. "I thought I wanted silence," he murmured, the rifle resting easy in the crook of his arm. "I thought I wanted to be alone until the day I died. But the silence gets loud, May. It gets heavy." He glanced at her, a fleeting look of vulnerability that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Having you here, the noise of you breathing, the sound of you walking, it's been the first time this place felt like a home instead of a box. May felt tears prick her eyes, hot and sudden. She had spent her life trying to be invisible, trying to be silent so she wouldn't be hurt. To hear that her presence, her simple, living existence, was a comfort rather than a burden shifted something fundamental in her chest. She wasn't just a victim to be saved. She was a partner in this vigil. Dawn arrived not with the sun, but with a gray, sickly lightning of the storm. The visibility improved, revealing the stark black skeletons of the pine trees against the white ground. And then the movement came. It wasn't a hidden approach. It was arrogant. 3 horses emerged from the tree line, wading through the drifts. The riders were bundled in furs, faceless, scarved figures, but the man in the center sat tall, his posture radiating a terrifying ownership. May stopped breathing. She knew that coat. She knew the way he held the reins, tight and cruel. The stepfather. He didn't ride to the door. He stopped 50 yards out, just at the edge of shouting distance. The other 2 men fanned out, rifles resting casually across their saddles. They were the posse Harlan had warned of, hired guns or perhaps misled lawmen, convinced they were recovering a thief. Harlan didn't wait for them to knock. He used the butt of his rifle to smash the upper pane of the window, the sound of shattering glass shocking the morning air. He leveled the barrel through the jagged hole, aiming not at the men, but at the ground in front of the lead horse. "That's far enough," Harlan's voice boomed, amplified by the crisp air. "Private land. Turn around." The man in the center laughed, a sound that carried like smoke. He nudged his horse forward a single step. "Harlan, is it?" the stepfather called out, his voice smooth, cultured, and dripping with false civility. "I have no quarrel with you, sir. I've come for my daughter. She's unwell, confused. She spun you a tale, I'm sure, but a father's love is patient." He gestured to the cabin with a gloved hand. "Send her out. I have the gold for your trouble right here. 500 as promised. You can go back to your quiet life." May, peeking through the chinking between the logs, felt a phantom hand around her throat. The lie was so perfect. Confused. Unwell. It made Harlan look like a kidnapper and him look like a savior. The other 2 riders shifted, looking less like thugs and more like righteous men aiding a grieving father. This was his power. He twisted reality until the victim looked like the villain. Harlan didn't flinch. He didn't look back at May for confirmation. He had already made his choice. "She's not confused," Harlan called back, his voice flat and deadly calm. "And she's not your daughter." The stepfather's pleasant mask slipped, just a fraction. "She is my ward, my property by marriage, and she is a thief. You are harboring a criminal, sir. That makes you one, too." One of the riders, a man with a tin star pinned to his coat, a sheriff, deceived by the money and the lie, spoke up. "Just send the girl out, mister. We don't want bloodshed. He says she stole from him. Let the law sort it out." Harlan racked the slide of his rifle, the clack-clack distinct and loud. "The law stops at my fence line when the law is bought," Harlan said. "She says you're a killer. She says she knows where the bodies are. I believe her." The silence that followed was absolute. The sheriff looked at the stepfather, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. The stepfather stiffened, the pretense of civility vanishing entirely. "She is a liar," he hissed, his voice dropping an octave, becoming the monster May remembered in the dark. "And you are a dead man. Burn it." He signaled to the men, "Burn them out." The sheriff hesitated, but the 3rd man, a hired gun with no such scruples, reached for a torch strapped to his saddle. The threat shifted from words to fire. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced May's chest. They would die. They would burn in this box because she was too weak to speak. Harlan shifted his aim, targeting the man with the torch, but he was outnumbered 3-1 in the open. If he fired, they would riddle the cabin with bullets. He needed a pause. He needed a doubt. May realized that Harlan could use his rifle, but he couldn't fight the lie. Only she could do that. Her fear was a towering wave, but beneath it was a singular, hard point of anger. She looked at the door, unbarred but closed. She didn't think. She moved. She threw the latch and stepped out onto the porch, the freezing wind hitting her face, shocking her senses. Behind her, she heard Harlan shout her name, a sound of pure terror, but she didn't stop until she was at the railing. She stood there, small against the vast white backdrop, the wind whipping her hair across her face. The men stopped. The torch was lowered. They stared at her, this ghost of a girl they had been hunting. She looked at the sheriff, locking eyes with him. She raised her hand, pointing a trembling finger not at the woods, but directly at the stepfather. "Ask him!" she screamed, her voice tearing from her throat, raw and loud, echoing off the valley walls. "Ask him about the girl in the well at Rock Creek. Ask him about the wife he buried in the cellar before he bought my mother." The specificity of the detail hit the group like a physical blow. The sheriff's head snapped toward the stepfather. The stepfather reached for his pistol, his face contorting into a mask of rage that confirmed everything. "Shut your mouth, you little wretch," he roared, raising the gun. But the hesitation was gone. The sheriff saw the truth in the violence of the reaction. Before the stepfather could fire, a shot rang out, not from the sheriff, but from the cabin. Harlan had fired. The stepfather's pistol spun from his hand, exploded by the impact of Harlan's bullet, leaving him gripping a shattered, bloody hand. The sheriff drew his weapon, but he leveled it at the stepfather, not the porch. "Don't move," the sheriff barked, the authority real this time. "Get down from the horse." The third man, seeing the tide turn and the precision of the shot from the dark window, dropped his torch into the snow and raised his hands. May stood on the porch, shaking violently, the adrenaline crashing out of her system. She watched as the stepfather was pulled from his horse, broken and screaming, stripped of his power by the truth spoken aloud. Harlan stepped out onto the porch behind her. He didn't speak. He simply wrapped his heavy sheepskin coat around her shoulders, engulfing her in his warmth, and pulled her back against his chest, shielding her from the sight of the violence, standing between her and the world until the riders dragged the darkness away. Spring came to the mountain not as a date on a calendar, but as a sound, the sound of dripping water, the relentless rhythmic music of the snow surrendering to the sun. The cabin door stood open, propped with a stone, letting the fresh air chase out the stale memory of winter and fear. May sat on the porch steps, a bowl of shelling peas in her lap. The bruise on her jaw was a distant memory, erased by time and peace. She wore a dress made of the blue wool Harlan had bought, stitched by her own hand, fitting her form not as a hiding place, but as a garment. She watched Harlan down by the corral. He was repairing the fence, his movements slow and easy. He wasn't guarding the perimeter anymore. He was tending it. He looked up, sensing her gaze, and wiped his brow. He didn't smile. He wasn't a man who smiled often, but his face was open, soft. He walked up the path, the mud squelching under his boots, and sat beside her on the step. He didn't say anything for a long time, just watching the valley turn green below them. "Sheriff sent word," Harlan said quietly. "Trial is over. He won't be coming back. None of them will." It was the final period at the end of a long, dark sentence. May nodded, her fingers pausing on a pea pod. The question that had been hanging between them, the "what now?" floated in the air. She was free. She could go anywhere. The world was wide, and she was no longer hunted. But she looked at the man beside her, at the rough hands that had built a fortress to keep her safe, at the profile that had become her horizon. She didn't want the wide world. She wanted this small, quiet piece of it. She reached out and placed her hand over his, pressing it flat against the warm wood of the step. "I planted the seeds," she said, her voice clear and steady, no longer a whisper. "The garden will need tending until harvest." Harlan looked down at her hand, then up at her eyes. A slow, genuine warmth spread through his expression, breaking the stoicism he had worn for years. He turned his hand over, intertwining his fingers with hers, holding on tight. "Then we'd best get to work," he said. And in the quiet of the mountain, with the winter behind them, it sounded like a promise of forever.